Great. Hello, everyone. We're excited to see you all today. My name is Seth Kirschenberg. I see people are just starting to enter in, so I'm going to give everybody a second to do that. Those of you who joined us earlier, we're very excited about this particular session. We'll get started in another minute. Great. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Seth Kirschenberg. I'm the Executive Director of Energy Communities Alliance. We're excited to see you all here today. So ECA, we are voracious readers of the GAO reports. And when we read this particular report, which is titled Nuclear Waste and Integrated Disposal Plan Could Help DOE Complete Its Cleanup Mission and Save Billions, we said to ourselves, this is what EM should look at for its future strategy. That's how simply we thought of it. And I sent Amanda and Nathan an email that said, wow, this report is very exciting because I think it not only identifies key issues that we all need to be thinking about, what are the potential costs and issues facing DOE, but also what is the future? How do we move forward? What are some ideas? What are some best practices? And GAO's come up with some of these things and ideas in the past, but this report, I thought, brought a lot of it together. So we really appreciated it as we move forward. I also think that we need to think about this is, an interesting time. EM's proposed budget had a $300 million cut. The House, when it came out of the House Appropriations Committee, there was at least a $300 million cut in the budget. So EM has to look at its program and how do we become more efficient to make sure that the work is still getting done and that we identify a lot of the key issues as we move forward. So I'm going to introduce our speakers, get out of the way, and then we're going to have a really good discussion to talk about these issues and how we move forward. Everybody who's on the call, please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try and get to them both during the session. And then at the end, we're definitely going to go through and have questions that we go forward on. So remember to put the questions in the Q&A. The one last thing I want to talk about is just remember ECA has its cleanup workshop at the end of September, where we're going to be talking about a lot of these issues directly with the leadership at the Department of Energy, in EM, with the contractors, with the communities. It's always a great event, so we hope to see you there. So with that, let me introduce Nathan and Amanda. Nathan Anderson is the Director of Natural Resources and Environment at GAO, and Amanda Coling is the Assistant Director of Natural Resources and Environment at GAO. And they're longtime friends of ECA and the communities, and they give us great information all the time. So with that, let me hand it over to Nathan.
Thanks, Seth. Quick sound check, thumbs up. Can you hear me all right? Okay. And we'll hope to see you at the National Cleanup Workshop. We try to send as many people as we can annually. We'll send as many people as our budget allows this year. And so if there's questions that anybody doesn't get to ask, feel free to grab us at the cleanup workshop. That's a kind of a crucial event in this portfolio of work for us as well, and we hope to see many people there. You talked about being voracious readers of GAO reports. We're voluminous producers of pages, and so we appreciate anybody who's voraciously reading all of those pages. Sometimes I can certainly empathize with those who don't want to read footnote 97 on page 73 of a GAO report. This one might be different. This one might indeed be one of those that I say, no, please read every word. We try very hard to do the right jobs at the right time in the right ways if we have the resources to do it. And this was one that all the way up to the top of the agency was viewed as one where we really needed to invest resources in this particular scope of work. And so we're very pleased to be invited to speak here today. Again, my name is Nathan Anderson. I'm the director at GAO for this scope of work. I wear a couple hats. One is DOE nuclear waste cleanup. Other is U.S. government-wide environmental liabilities. Both of those hats can be worn today and in this area of work, Amanda Coling. I worked very closely with her in virtually all things related to EM and environmental liabilities, and she was on the front lines of designing and executing this particular engagement. Do we have slides up at the moment that folks can see? Looks like they're coming. All right, AJ, could you toggle to slide 2, please? By way of background, I know many of you know who we are, what we do. We are, an independent, nonpartisan agency of Congress. We've been around for a little more than 100 years. 90+% of our work is congressionally directed, which means it comes to us in the form of request letters from either chairman or ranking members of committees of jurisdiction, or are embedded as mandates within law. This particular engagement came through the four corners, the Armed Services Committees, both Senate Armed Services Committee, House Armed Services Committee, and then the HUD and SUD on the appropriations side, all four that are involved in defense space. Oftentimes, if the weight of evidence warrants it, our reports include recommendations to federal agencies to improve operations. We also, if the vulnerabilities exist that have to be fixed on Congress's side, we will also make recommendations to Congress. 90% of the time, 85% of the time, when we find issues that warrant fixing, it's a recommendation to an executive branch agency. 10 to 15% of the time, I think it goes to Congress. Next slide, please. All right, with this particular scope of work, we're gonna get into the next handful of slides, and we're gonna walk through the different types of waste, what is known about them, what is known about their volumes, what is known about their disposition pathways. I was asked to do, by Federal News Network, I was asked to do an interview on this particular one, and we talked about the 11 million cubic meters, excuse me, and it's at least 11 million cubic meters, right? Like oftentimes GAO, we're gonna, in an estimated range, we're gonna lean into the low end estimate. That includes volumes of waste, it also includes costs. So we are very well aware that the actual amount may be well in excess of 11 cubic meters. But that's 4,500 Olympic-sized swimming pools, that's 11 Empire State Buildings worth of waste. I'm sure we could give you some figure in dishwashers or refrigerators, but it's a lot, and we'll just leave it at that. I'm going to ask Amanda Coling to really get into the meat of what we did here, and then I'll circle back kind of at the end of the slide presentation anyway to wrap things up. So Amanda, over to you.
All right, thanks, Nathan. Next slide, please. So I'm first going to walk through all three different waste types and share a little bit about what is known about the waste types. So first, low-level waste. Most of EM's remaining sites have some low-level waste that requires disposal. And overall, the amount of low-level waste that is required to be disposed of is typically much, much larger than the other two types of waste. Out of the over 11 million cubic meters of waste that Nathan just referenced, almost 11 million cubic meters of that waste is actually low-level waste. Now, examples of low-level waste include things like soil and debris that have been excavated, or waste from facilities that were decontaminated and decommissioned. Now, it's the site contractors who generally collect information about low-level waste volumes, and then EM compiles the data from those contractors in something called the BLDD, which is the baseline low-level waste and material disposition data. Next slide, please. So this will be a recurring theme that you see across all three waste types, but we found that EM's estimates of its low-level waste volumes are incomplete and uncertain. Notably, 9 out of EM's 15 sites were missing significant amounts of waste in its low-level waste estimates. So I'm going to unpack some of the reasons for why EM's estimates are incomplete. The first one is that, as I mentioned, EM relies on its site contractors to develop its estimates of remaining low-level waste. we found that contractors at multiple sites don't always include estimates for waste disposal beyond their current cleanup contract. Also, contractors often use different methods to estimate the amount of low-level waste that would be generated as part of its cleanup efforts. Second, the low-level waste estimates don't always include data about waste streams that EM hasn't reached agreement with its regulators on a final disposal approach, or if they haven't made a final decision on what they're going to do with a certain cleanup project. So according to EM officials, sites should not include that information in their estimates because doing so would actually raise challenges in EM's interactions with regulators and stakeholders. So I'll share a few examples of where this comes up. One is West Valley Demonstration Project in New York State. EM's estimates in the BLDD only include waste from phase 1A of the site's cleanup, and that's expected to be finished soon. Phase 1B and phase 2 are not included in the BLDD. And in fact, EM officials said that phase 1B is expected to generate even more waste than phase 1A did. And they're still evaluating cleanup options for phase 2, but it's possible that the cleanup of the contaminated facilities and soil during phase 2 could be almost 700,000 cubic meters of low-level waste that will require off-site disposal. Again, this information is not included in the BLDD. Just as another example for you is Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. The BLDD does not include waste from the buried pits and shafts in material disposal area C. And if that waste were exhumed, DOE estimates it could be over 300,000 cubic meters of mixed low-level waste that would require off-site disposal. Again, that is not in the BLDD. We have a number of other examples in the report, but this is an area that I think is leading to some of this incomplete information. Third, there are just some inherent unknowns. In some cases, EM is conducting cleanup for other DOE offices like NNSA and the Office of Science, and some of that generated waste will eventually become EM's responsibility, but EM officials told us they don't always know how much waste that will include. Also, the low-level waste estimates don't always include whether a waste stream will face a barrier to disposal, and I'll talk more about that later on. And the fourth and final reason is that we found that EM does not assess the quality of its low-level waste estimates, and that raises questions about the usefulness of the data for long-term planning and for decision-making purposes. I just want to note we do make some recommendations to DOE to address some of these issues, and we'll cover that more at the end of this discussion. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to move on to transuranic waste. You'll probably already know this, but transuranic waste or true waste, it generally consists of contaminated materials like solid sludges, clothing, tools, rags, residues, debris, things that were generated from the production of plutonium. So much of this waste was historically packaged in boxes and temporarily buried in dirt trenches on sites. And in some cases, it will need to be retrieved and packaged for disposal. EM tracks its transuranic waste estimates in the annual True Waste Inventory Report, known as the ATWIR. Next slide, please. Okay, again, EM's True Waste Inventory may actually underestimate the amount of waste that will require disposal. I want to point out that EM has captured some uncertainty in the ATWIR. They refer to this as potential waste, and this is waste that sites believe may be appropriate for disposal at WIP. But there are technical, legal, or regulatory considerations that would first have to be addressed before it can go to WIP. Some examples of potential waste. One is at the Hanford site, waste generated from future deactivation and decommissioning of facilities. This includes, for example, the Purex facility and tunnels. According to Hanford officials, this waste was reported as potential waste because they haven't developed specific cleanup plans, and therefore there's insufficient information about the waste characteristics. Another example is sodium-bearing waste being treated at the IWTU at Idaho National Laboratory, the Integrated Waste Treatment Unit. Idaho officials acknowledge that there are legal and regulatory issues that would need to be resolved before that sodium-bearing waste could be classified as transuranic waste and then disposed of at WIPP. So why are EM's true waste estimates uncertain? The first reason that we found is that WEIR doesn't always include information on true waste that could be generated by unplanned future cleanup activities. So example of that is EM hasn't developed estimates for true waste volumes from unplanned future deactivation and decommissioning projects at, for example, Los Alamos and the Savannah River site. And second, there could just be changes in final disposal volumes. In some cases, the actual volume of waste disposed of at WIPP could be higher than current estimates. For example, EM may actually need to repackage certain waste into multiple containers, which would in turn increase the volume of waste. In other cases, the actual volume of true waste could be lower than what EM is estimating because they're actively working to develop more efficient waste packaging processes. I do want to note that EM does not use range estimates to reflect these uncertainties in the WEIR because EM considers that to be speculative. Next slide. So our last category waste is high-level waste and spent nuclear fuel. For high-level waste, 4 EM sites currently manage high-level waste: Savannah River site, Hanford site, Idaho National Laboratory, and the West Valley Demonstration Project. The majority of EM's high-level waste is in underground tanks, or it had been in an underground tank at one time. For DOE-owned spent nuclear fuel, 3 sites have some spent nuclear fuel: Savannah River site, Hanford site, and again, Idaho National Laboratory. Some of this waste has already been packaged and is being temporarily stored on on-site facilities for future shipment to an off-site repository when it becomes available. Idaho National Laboratory manages its spent nuclear fuel both on site and at the Fort St. Vrain and in Colorado. Okay, next slide, please. So again, EM's estimates of high-level waste and spent nuclear fuel may have some uncertainty. EM is not actively generating new high-level waste or spent nuclear fuel, so the volume is unlikely to increase. However, EM could potentially reduce the volume of waste that needs to be treated and disposed of as high-level waste. So just to back up a little bit, as a matter of policy, EM manages certain waste at Hanford, Idaho, and Savannah River as if it is high-level radioactive waste, unless and until that waste has been formally classified as another waste type. So this especially is the case for tank waste. EM manages its tank waste as high-level waste because much of it originated from the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel. So Hanford and Savannah River both consider over 90% of their tank waste to be actually low activity waste, meaning it has lower levels of radioactivity. So I'll talk more about this in a minute, but even though it's being managed as high-level waste, it's actually very low in radioactivity. So a couple of site-specific details. Out at Hanford, cleanup decisions about certain waste just haven't been made yet. So there's some uncertainty about the amount of waste that will actually need to be treated and disposed of as high-level waste. About 90% of the tank waste is considered to be low-activity waste, like I just mentioned, and that's after it's been retrieved and after certain radionuclides have been removed. Hanford plans to treat about half of its low-activity waste by vitrifying it in their upcoming DF-LAW facility. They'll plan to classify it as low-level waste and dispose of it on site. And as many of you know, in January 2025, DOE, EPA, and the state of Washington agreed that EM would classify another portion of its low-activity waste as low-level waste. And then they would grout it and dispose of it at facilities outside of the state of Washington. And if EM's able to carry out those plans, the volume of waste that Hanford needs to treat and dispose of as high-level waste would be significantly reduced. In September 2024, we also found that some portion of that remaining 5 to 10% of the tank waste that Hanford does plan to treat and dispose of as a high-level waste, some of that so-called high-level waste may actually be able to be disposed of as low-level or true waste. and that would further reduce the amount of high-level waste inventory. So for Idaho site, Idaho's managing its sodium-bearing waste as high-level waste. That's about 772,000 gallons. DOE has said that it believes it can dispose of this waste as transuranic waste at WIP, but there are legal barriers to doing so. For example, WIP's permit prohibits disposal of waste that had been managed as high-level waste, so that could be a regulatory barrier. But EM hasn't made any official disposal decisions yet. That waste is currently being treated and packaged as if it were true waste, even though it's reflected in EM's high-level waste estimates. Now for Savannah River site, they've already determined that a large portion of their tank waste can be disposed of as low-level waste. So EM is actively treating that salt waste with saltstone, and they're disposing of it on site at the saltstone disposal unit. And then just a quick note about spent nuclear fuel. Idaho National Laboratory maintains information about spent nuclear fuel that EM's responsible for. It's called the Spent Fuel Database. The inventory of spent nuclear fuel is pretty stable, and it's not expected to change much. The waste is stored in stainless steel canisters on site until there's a permanent offsite repository. All right, next slide. So I'm going to shift now to disposal. Big picture, meeting EM's disposal needs will likely require additional capacity beyond what is currently available. So I'm going to walk through all three waste types and what's known about disposal capacity. First, low-level waste. According to low-level waste estimates in the BLDD, 6 of EM's 15 cleanup sites will use on-site low-level waste disposal facilities to dispose of its waste. EM also plans to use 3 off-site facilities. This includes a federal disposal facility at the Nevada National Security Site. There are also 2 commercial disposal facilities. One is called Waste Control Specialists in Texas. The other is Energy Solutions in Utah. And DOE plans to dispose of about 1.48 million cubic meters of its waste at those 3 sites. Next slide. All right, so EM headquarters officials that we interviewed told us that they do believe there is sufficient low-level waste capacity for disposal, but our analysis shows that off-site capacity will likely need to be expanded to meet EM's estimated disposal needs. So first, on-site disposal. Officials at sites with on-site disposal facilities, they told us they expect the capacity of their facilities will be sufficient to complete low-level waste cleanup at their sites. One exception to that is Oak Ridge, which is currently constructing a second on-site disposal facility to meet its disposal needs. And then also officials at the Paducah site are conducting an analysis of alternatives to address its low-level disposal needs. And that does include pursuing an on-site disposal facility. For off-site disposal, EM officials told us that off-site commercial facilities use a build-as-needed approach, and they do have the ability to expand their capacity. Based on our analysis, we found that DOE disposal needs exceed the current capacity of off-site disposal facilities. And what I mean by that is that if you also factor in their expansion capacity that's already received regulatory approval, if needed, we found there's likely sufficient capacity to meet current estimates of DOE's off-site disposal needs. So it's kind of the difference between what the current hole in the ground and what they've received permission to, dig additional holes in the ground, to put it simply. We'll talk more about why that matters, but this is just an example of why integrated planning and communication is so essential. If DOE doesn't communicate its future disposal needs, then there isn't necessarily a guarantee that the disposal facilities will pursue that expansion capacity. All right, next slide, please. So transuranic waste disposal. The Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, WIP, it's a disposal deep geological repository in New Mexico, and it's currently the only disposal option for transuranic waste generated for defense purposes. The WIP Land Withdrawal Act, it limits the volume of true waste that can be disposed of at WIP. Now, EM does have sufficient capacity for disposing of true waste at WIP, but additional waste could exceed WIP's disposal limits. As I mentioned earlier, there is additional waste, especially in that like potential waste category I mentioned. That waste could, get it pretty close to their full capacity. And then there could be other true waste that's generated by future unplanned cleanup work, and that would come very close to reaching WIP's capacity. In fact, if all potential waste that was identified in the 2024 ATWER were disposed of at WIP, it would leave only 604 cubic meters of WIP's statutory capacity remaining. Right, next slide, please. Finally, high-level waste and spent nuclear fuel. As you all know, there is currently no geologic repository for the permanent disposal of high-level waste and spent nuclear fuel. In the interim, all of this waste is stored on site until a permanent repository is identified and developed. Now, officials from DOE's Office of Nuclear Energy told us that their current estimate for when a repository might become available is 2065. However, until Congress passes legislation that designates a location other than Yucca Mountain for a repository, any proposal would not be able to move forward. So DOE officials told us it could take up to 50 years once a repository opens to dispose of all of the waste. That includes commercial spent nuclear fuel, defense high-level waste, and then DOE spent nuclear fuel. And officials emphasize there's been no decision made about the sequencing of the disposal of this waste. We did find that EM cites planning assumptions for the disposal of high-level waste and spent nuclear fuel don't necessarily align with DOE's potential dates for opening a repository. And because of this, the 4 EM sites with high-level waste may have challenges meeting its regulatory deadlines and may incur unplanned costs to store this waste on site. So just one example of this, at Idaho National Laboratory, the 1995 settlement agreement requires DOE to remove all spent nuclear fuel from Idaho by January 2035. As another example, the Savannah River site, their plans indicate that it would start shipping its vitrified high-level waste to a repository by 2058. That's 7 years before the Office of Nuclear Energy anticipates even opening a repository. And then finally, Hanford officials told us that they estimate it could cost around $30 million annually to store its high-level waste after it's been vitrified. And DOE will continue to incur costs for storage until there is a repository. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so finally, I'm going to discuss some overarching issues that affect all of EM, excuse me. First big issue is barriers to disposal. EM has not necessarily taken steps to address waste streams with disposal barriers. At least 9 different waste streams across the EM complex face barriers to disposal, and EM hasn't undertaken centralized planning to fully address those barriers. And in fact, if you open our report at some point, check out Appendix 2, there's an overview of each of those 9 waste streams and some of the issues associated with them. Just a couple of examples. One is greater than Class C waste. This is primarily generated metals from nuclear facilities, materials sealed in industrial and medical equipment, or other forms like debris and gear. There are currently no legally viable disposal options for GTCC and GTCC-like waste. Another example is depleted uranium oxide from Portsmouth and Paducah. Currently, only Waste Control Specialist is able to accept this waste, but it's an enormous volume of waste, approximately 60,000 cylinders at Portsmouth and Paducah. And then a third example is Idaho's sodium-bearing waste, which I already mentioned a few minutes ago, but this waste is currently being managed as high-level waste, but DOE plans to dispose of it as true waste at WIP. WIP's permit prohibits the disposal of tank waste, so DOE will need to address this before proceeding with disposal of that waste. There's also some complex-wide disposal issues that we highlight in our report. One is communication with states that host disposal sites. So we spoke with state regulators in Texas, Utah, and New Mexico, and all of them essentially said DOE doesn't do a great job of communicating its long-term and complex-wide disposal plans. Another complex-wide issue is the long-term availability of low-level waste off-site disposal facilities. We found that EM hasn't assessed the long-term availability of commercial facilities, so particularly waste control specialists and energy solutions, both in terms of ensuring that they have sufficient capacity and the financial stability of the commercial disposal facilities. These are both commercial facilities, so there's no guarantee that they're going to operate decades into the future. A second key issue here is optimization. EM headquarters told us that they have not developed complex-wide analyses for assessing alternate approaches for optimizing its waste disposal efforts. They told us they haven't done this in part because EM faces regulatory constraints from legal and regulatory agreements with parties at its cleanup and waste disposal sites. Now, EM's 2020 program management protocol actually states that EM headquarters should coordinate with its sites to periodically identify and conduct analysis of strategic alternatives to its plans. And these analyses may include assessing potential alternatives as a result of regulatory changes. And it says the analyses should identify opportunities to lower overall life cycle costs. So we decided to demonstrate the value of assessing complex-wide strategic alternatives. And we worked with a team within GAO to develop a hypothetical optimization model as an example of how true waste disposal decisions could potentially be optimized to reduce costs. We found that by considering only the costs of true waste storage, transportation, and disposal, and not taking existing regulatory constraints into account, EM could reduce its costs associated with true waste disposal. I want to note that annual storage costs at certain sites were greater than others. So essentially, overall costs could be reduced by reprioritizing the order, the sequencing in which EM plans to ship its waste to WIP. Now, in prior GEO reports, we've also identified other opportunities to save billions of dollars by considering alternate plans for other waste types aside from transuranic waste. So most notably, we've reported several times that DOE could save billions of dollars by treating Hanford's low activity waste with grout and disposing of it outside of the state. Third issue, integrated planning. EM told us that they do an integrated planning through a variety of documents, namely the EM strategic vision and EM's program plans, standard operating procedures. But these documents we found actually focus on sites individually, and they don't integrate site level information into a complex-wide plan. DOE Manual 435.1 says that EM headquarters should develop a complex-wide waste management plan that addresses the storage, treatment, and disposal of all three waste types. And officials said they haven't done this because they rely on their sites to conduct this planning. Finally, stakeholder outreach. So as part of pursuing an integrated approach to waste disposal, we found that EM has an opportunity to engage its regulators across its sites to address regulatory constraints and pursue a more optimized approach to waste disposal. This, in turn, could accelerate EM's cleanup mission and save taxpayer dollars. We acknowledge that to implement an optimized and integrated disposal plan, EM would need to negotiate with multiple states and federal regulators to revise its existing permits and agreements that pertain to EM's disposal sites. So we do make several recommendations to address these overarching issues, which Nathan will discuss in a few minutes. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nathan.
Thank you, Amanda. I think we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, I wanted to add this slide to the deck, and hopefully you can all see it and perhaps have access to it after the fact. This comes from if not, this does come from the public GAO report, GAO-24-105 1.5975. And I can try to furnish everybody with that information, but it's basically our summer 2024 report on implementation of the program management protocol. And I think what's notable about this slide at a very high level is it's going to cost an awful lot of money for EM to achieve its cleanup mission. The to-go costs are staggering. Oftentimes we talk about the environmental liability in GAO space. The environmental liability is north of $400 billion, but that is an underestimate of total remaining life cycle costs, because environmental liabilities only have to include those cleanup remedies that are probable and reasonably estimable. So there is quite a scope of work out there that estimates have not yet been generated for that will add to the cleanup costs in the future. Now, obviously, cleanup costs do not need to be the only or even the most significant factor when talking about disposal, but it is something that GAO is always asked to do. You know, we are exist in part to follow the taxpayer dollar and report on how it's spent. And so, in our world and in our extension, being extensions of Congress's oversight responsibilities, in our world, we always do look at costs and to-go costs. So when Amanda was speaking of the optimization analysis that we developed with our innovation lab in-house, costs, hotel costs in particular, were one of the important inputs that we tried to optimize on, just to see if there was an alternative to the status quo and what that alternative was ultimately priced at. Next slide, please. Our report, concluded with 5 recommendations. The first 2 really talk about the quality of data. This is a standard internal control practice that GAO advocates for when it is missing. And I think, as you can glean from Amanda's presentation, DOE does need to improve the quality of its low-level waste estimates, as well as updating guidance for reporting low-level waste estimates in its database. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th recommendation have more of a perhaps a forward-looking strategic planning flavor to them, and the 3rd is on developing the complex-wide analyses, including the optimization models that we showed was possible. Now we did our optimization model using True Waste because True Waste was that segment of EM's responsibilities that could be modeled cradle to grave. And as we've already talked about, and many of you intimately know, there are other waste streams that simply do not have a disposal pathway, making those harder to model from an optimization standpoint. Recommendation 4, as you can see here, is to develop that nationwide integrated radioactive waste disposal plan that is lacking. With items 3 and 4 being included as inputs, we then recommended that DOE create a forum for regulators from cleanup sites and disposal facilities to holistically negotiate implementing some of these opportunities that may exist. What I think you can see here is that the evidence seems to exist that suggests the status quo needs to be disrupted. What I mean by the status quo being disrupted, it does not appear that DOE is going to be able to meet all of its cleanup agreements with all of its sites, with all of its states. And so there will need to be renegotiations that take place. At virtually every site, DOE is actively involved in modifying those agreements that govern its work, but rarely does it have those conversations across sites. It's much more stovepiped. Here, there may be opportunities for DOE to gain efficiencies by having a holistic forum where everybody is able to be brought together. Next slide, please. I think that what our recommendations also aim to do is to get away from the decide, announce, defend feeling that some people have when working with DOE in the past, and instead create the analytical building blocks that allow for a much more engaged discussion to take place. So I know that sometimes reading those recommendations, there's some bureaucratic rhetoric involved in them, but that's the kind of the essence of where GAO is pointing DOE in this space to get away from the decide, announce, defend approach that people sometimes feel comes with DOE's decisions in this space, and ensure that the analytical building blocks are there if we're going to renegotiate some of these agreements with states. Our work continues. We do note that the documents coming out of the Senate associated with the NDAA this week, last week, contain requirements for DOE to implement the recommendations 3, 4, and 5 that were on the previous slide. As was mentioned, DOE did not necessarily comment on our report in terms of its concurrence with the recommendations or not. It doesn't have to, at least immediately. There is a requirement that within 180 days of the issuance of a GAO report that contains recommendations, the executive branch agency that is the focus of those recommendations does need to respond to Congress with its plan for implementing those recs or a justification for why it does not concur. So that will be something we'll be looking forward to, again, roughly 6 months from the public issuance of the report. So end of the calendar year, beginning of next calendar year timeframe. In addition to the National Defense Authorization Act provisions that require implementations of Rec 3, 4, and 5, we have ongoing related work. We right now have a team looking at the legal and regulatory framework for nuclear waste cleanup. As many of you can imagine, that is a large scope of work, and we have entered into an agreement with the National Academies to help build an expert panel as part of that methodology. We also have an engagement looking at international lessons learned. Many of our counterparts across the Atlantic and other spaces are farther along than we are on certain things related to nuclear waste disposal. And we are going to be relying on them to help provide us some lessons learned where applicable. And then we have a couple of reports that we've recently issued that I think are relevant in this space. Amanda talked about our work on stakeholder engagement. We issued a report late last year, September timeframe, that talked about best practices for stakeholder engagement. That can really be a roadmap here if EM embarks on the forum that is embedded within our 5th recommendation. And then finally, it would be conspicuous by its absence, but we reported last year on EM workforce capacity and some of the vacancies in mission critical positions. Clearly, since issuance of that report, there have been additional vacancies, and it's impossible not to look at EM's mission in this space without also looking at the workforce needs and the vacancies that have occurred in certain key positions and the ability of EM to carry it out. I will say, and I said this in a podcast and then also in an interview with Federal News Network, that ultimately it comes down to leadership commitment within the department. Even with some of the reductions in workforce that EM and DOE has faced, if senior leadership within EM and the department want to prioritize this issue, it can happen. It can get done. That may be it. I think we have a next slide that might just simply be a stock slide for GAO. So with that, I'll stop talking and maybe we turn it back over to Seth to facilitate the discussion.
Great, and thank you. That was fantastic. There's a reason why after I read the report I said wow, and I think for the Senate also in the National Defense Authorization Act to say we want to see this report implemented really shows you the depth and breadth and the issues that were identified. I do want to say to everybody that we did invite EM to participate in this call as well, but they were not able to. But I think that, as Amanda and Nathan said, these are opportunities. These aren't just problems. They are problems, but they're really opportunities because it's a potential pathway to move forward. One of the things, when I looked at it, the first comment that I really had was after 36 years, we still don't know what all the issues are in the EM program. And so, Amanda, when you were talking about the low-level waste piece and the issues, can you just highlight for me again why DOE, you gave the Los Alamos example and some other examples. Why aren't they doing the analysis and why aren't they reporting out those additional items that they know that they need to analyze?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. There was a lot of content, so I'm happy to go through this a little bit more. Yeah, there were a few reasons for this. One is, again, EM's relying on its site contractors to, track and record this data. And the contractors sometimes use different methods for how it records its low-level waste estimates. And also, sometimes the contractors are not estimating waste beyond their contract timeframe. And so they're not necessarily capturing the long-term estimates. There's also, they don't always include data about waste that they haven't made an agreement about how it's going to address it, or they haven't made a final decision about what to do with the waste. So that waste just may not be included in their inventory at all. So I included the example about West Valley and the phase 1A, 1B, and 2. I mentioned Los Alamos. This is also the case for Hanford's low activity waste. That's like about 90% of their tank waste. And the waste that they plan to grout, for example, as part of their recent holistic agreement, it's not captured in the BLDD. And that would generate a pretty significant amount of waste that isn't represented in the inventory. Another example I didn't mention was at ETAC, the Energy Technology Engineering Center in California. EM and California regulators haven't yet reached agreement on the cleanup method for contaminated soil. And a 2018 environmental analysis by DOE said that could generate 84,000 cubic meters of low-level waste. So, we found that it's really important that EM captures more complete estimates and does more, quality assurance checks on this database so that it has a better estimate of how much waste it needs to dispose of over the long term.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's interesting. I remember going with Los Alamos for about 15 years going into EM to say, please do a risk assessment on this particular parcel. We are concerned what's here. And DOE kept saying, well, no, it's not a priority of the state, so we're not really doing it. And they did an analysis. Well, if you're standing outside of it, then there's really no risk. But they never did an assessment of the actual site, even though they kept saying that they wouldn't and would. And so it's interesting that you've highlighted kind of that site and said, hey, this is something they need to look at so they can get a capture and understand what their true potential costs are, whether they leave it in place, whether they dispose of it somewhere else. Finding those answers will help define for that particular site. And so as we go across all of the sites, those are really key issues that people should keep in mind and people should continue to ask DOE to take a look at, because assessing the sites is critical. Did you all look at and one of the things that we're starting to see with EM is they're starting to take on more missions. So whether it's helping NNSA take down buildings or helping naval reactors take down buildings or build buildings, how does that kind of integrate into this particular piece and the potential waste that's generated from that?
Yeah, we found that EM does also have incomplete information about whether it's responsible for waste streams that's been generated by other offices like NNSA and the Office of Science. EM generally expects that some of that generated waste will become their responsibility, but EM officials said they don't necessarily know how much. And again, that's not represented in their current low-level waste inventory.
Right. And Nathan, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything. No. Okay.
Nope. Go for it.
Okay. Great. And so as we keep looking forward, one of the things that we've all looked at before is the tank high level waste and the potential costs. Can you just remind everybody the previous GIO report, what you talked about as the potential savings depending on how that waste was treated?
Nathan, do you want to take that or?
Sure, I'm happy to start, and feel free to add any nuances, because I think the nuances are important in this space. We've done work on basically all the tank waste that was just technically considered high level waste by law, but has lower levels of radioactivity. Our report that we first did on this back in 2017, GAO-17-306, estimated tens of billions of dollars of savings. That report served as a prompt and a catalyst for what ended up being an FFRDC study peer reviewed by the National Academies. And I think the life cycle escalated cost savings for grouting and disposing off-site supplemental low activity waste was about $96 billion. And that was, I think, about 40% of the tank waste volume, if memory serves correct. On the high level waste fraction or portion, the portion of waste that is intended to go through the high level waste facility for vitrification. Last I heard from EM, it was about 3 million, maybe 3 to 4 million gallons. Our report from about a year and a half, 2 years ago, said that in excess of $10 billion could be saved by minimizing that fraction, because all of that volume isn't necessary to go through the high level waste facility. The facility, it could be right sized. There could be a TISCR-like or advanced mixed waste pretreatment system applied to the west area, where you're doing something tank size. You could probably get that volume of waste down to less than 1 million gallons that actually has to be vitrified, and stored as high level waste. So that's an extra, 10 billion plus in savings. So between adding those two numbers together, you're in excess of $100 billion of savings here if you were to right size the treatment based on its risk. Amanda, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that was a great response, Nathan.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty large number as we kind of look at these things. And, as we kind of look at this, from, the outside looking in somewhat on these projects, there's the whole piece of how the state and EPA regulatory agreements tie back into this decision making. And you identified some of those issues in the report. Can you maybe expand on, you said you talked to some of the states, how are they looking at this? Are they saying to DOE, hey, look, some of our agreements, we really don't want to change them until you get X, Y, and Z done? Or some of them saying, well, we're open to looking at and review different ways of moving forward. What were you hearing from the states?
Well, here's where I'd really like to point to that recommendation we have on the forum, because I think that's a way of getting all of the information out on the table. And I can appreciate the state's position. Sometimes they are not receiving information that may be valuable for them to help make a risk-informed decision. Now, look at the holistic agreement out at Washington. When there became a clear pathway and a sufficient weight of evidence to show the state of Washington that, hey, we can get some of this low activity waste out of state, completely out of your state using a different treatment methodology, the state agreed to it, right? I mean, the risk goes from exceedingly low to zero if the waste is not stored on site. And I can imagine in that situation, it was all about information sharing. Do you have the weight of evidence that exists to make a proposal where it's clear it benefits all parties? And in this case, the benefit to the state of Washington was you get this waste out of the state. The benefit to DOE is you potentially speed up the tank waste treatment mission, do things a little bit cheaper, and then can allocate some of those resources to the other needs at the Hanford site. And so, to kind of circle back again, I think that's the benefit of the forum. You have not just the state of Washington, but all the states, hopefully in an information receiving mode. And if there are information gaps, that can then be articulated as a gap that needs to be filled to make a different kind of decision. So again, I do think it's important, and it's incumbent upon DOE to share the information that allows the state to then have the ability to weigh the pros and cons of any kind of difference to the status quo.
I love that idea, because I think, if I remember back in the 90s, when all of this was new and the program was really just in its infancies, that's when you really had the states coming together with DOE and EPA to kind of look at these items. The agreements still hadn't been completed at that point, But I don't think since then we've really had that process come together quite as much. The states obviously always meet together and those types of things, but I don't think that this additional data information is provided. And I also don't think, and this is one of the things that really opened my eyes in your report, which was where those data gaps exist. I always knew some of them existed, but mine was more anecdotal. And I think that pointing people to decision making and at individual sites, as you said, it's not consistent across all of the sites. That's the type of thing that I think is helpful for us to say, okay, let's actually make this reporting consistent and let's actually report all of the information that's there and identify these are the sites we still have to characterize that we know about. Here are our new missions that potentially are coming down the pike. So we don't know what those fully are yet. We get that, but these are potential new missions as we're going forward. And then the other piece that you identified really, which is, okay, on the back end, where are we going to put all of this and how are we going to come up with those solutions? Because that part we're missing, drastically right now because we don't have a solution for high level waste. True waste, there's limitations that we need to be looking at for how do we get more into it. And then, also on the low level waste, is it on site? Is it off site? What kind of waste is it? So, I'd love additional comment on that.
Well, I might hand the mic over to Amanda here in a second because I think I've taken the last couple of questions and want to share the mic in this regard. But Seth, you said something that made me think of. I saw a snippet come through the chat function or the Q&A function, and I didn't read the whole thing because we were in the middle of speaking. But it had to deal with newly generated waste by outside EM parties, right? So NNSA, pit production. There's going to be a new waste stream there. And I do want to point your audience to a report that we issued in late calendar year 2024. We did an assessment of NNSA's strategy. NNSA was required to produce a strategy that said, what are we going to do with this newly generated waste? And it was lacking. As a practical matter, it did not include most of what it was supposed to include. And so we made a recommendation to NNSA that not only does it partner with EM, but that it does the legwork to develop a strategy that includes all of what would be needed to actually say, okay, we have a plan. We have a plan for this newly generated waste. The plan involves stakeholder engagement. And NNSA agreed with that recommendation and is on path to implement it. I need to look back at the date, but later this year or next year. So I wanted to be responsive to one of the comments I saw. What about the newly generated waste? That's an issue too. Yes, and we've got a report on that. Amanda, did you want to take a crack at answering Seth's question? No.
Well, I think I'll also add, because you asked about our conversations with the states and the regulators, and a key theme we heard over and over and over again is that the states and the regulators want increased communication. The states are saying, hey, we don't even know how, what DOE, what plans they're considering. We don't know how much waste they're planning to send here or to send there. We don't have a sense of what's the long-term plan. And so that's really, I think the spirit of these three recommendations is, hey, EM, take the opportunity to optimize your waste disposal options, develop an integrated plan, and then communicate this with your state regulators, because together you potentially have the opportunity to, shift the direction of how it approaches waste disposal in a, more practical way.
And I would add to that collectively, what Amanda just summarized, that helps lessen the trust deficit, that has long existed. And it's understandable how the trust deficit occurred, but I still think that we're dealing with the legacy of the trust deficit that stemmed from the defense mission, the secrecy behind the defense mission, and then the flip of the switch that metaphorically resulted in EM and the cleanup mission. Those recommendations, I think, can be powerful in terms of lessening the effects of the trust deficit between EM, the states, the localities, et cetera.
Well, the other interesting thing is, with some of the waste streams coming out of NNSA, the executive order recently said that the NNSA will not be moving forward with the dilute and dispose of the Savannah River spent nuclear fuel or high level or waste. I'll call it waste. To WIP. So, how does that impact the issues as well when it comes to WIP? So that was something that was out there, but now has changed. And I think we're going to see a fair amount of changes. We're seeing changes in the regulatory piece. I think, one of the questions comes to that, which is, the regulatory framework is changing right now a little bit, or potentially. And so, how do those things impact what we're doing at the individual sites? If it's 435, is it going to stay the same? Or is it going to change? Is it going to be implemented differently or thought of differently? Which is one of the key ways that DOE looks at cleanup. And so I think, those are all things that we're going to have to be watching as part of this, because I think there are ways of moving forward more quickly with cleanup while still meeting the cleanup goals of the states and the local communities. But it was really going to take DOE to look at it very carefully. And, I think your recommendations are a good way to do that. You've made certain recommendations with true waste. And I think, there's a lot of waste that's going to be generated as we continue with more of the D&D and everything else. And how do we address it so we don't have long-term, I think of some of the low-level waste facilities, and I call low-level waste disposal landfills, because I try and make it really simple, but it's a giant landfill that you're putting building debris in, typically. And so what happens when the community doesn't either want a new landfill or another landfill at the site, or what happens because, DOE in the past has made promises to communities. And so the more you put landfills on these sites, the more the community say, well, didn't you tell us that the last one was the last one that we're ever going to see? And so, it's those types of things that I think become more difficult. And that's the point that you're making, which is give everyone the true vision. Let everyone understand all of this now. As you're kind of briefing, and obviously the Senate was very excited about this report also for them to put that information in. What kind of questions that you could share that you're getting maybe from your own clients, or what kind of areas of questions do you get from your own clients?
Delicate question, so I apologize for a somewhat of a non-answer. Just simply because a lot of our clients in this space are also the clients on some of our ongoing jobs. And so if you can imagine a situation where we're having a conversation about the outcome and implications of this disposal report in the context of also talking, to our clients about, for example, we have a job going on right now on future land use planning. It's a bit of an evolution of interest, right? Like we learn more as we conduct an engagement like this, and that informs future engagements. Talked about regulatory framework, being an engagement that we're doing right now, and we're working with the national academies to convene a panel of experts in this space. This disposal report was very much looking at what DOE can do with the resources it has. That regulatory framework job is unpacking some of the vulnerabilities that may or may not exist in the landscape that Congress has put forward. So a slightly different scope of work in terms of the actor, but nevertheless still relevant in this space. So at the end of the day, Seth, it's a non-answer, in part because some of those conversations are confidential in terms of our dialoguing with Congress. But I think, like you said, you can see the implications of their response in the National Defense Authorization Act and embedding those recommendations in legislative language.
So if you were a state, what kind of question do you think, and you've got an individual site, what questions, I'm going to throw this one to Amanda. What questions, because you talk to the states, what questions do you think that the state should be asking the Department of Energy?
Yeah, I I have to say it's unusual for EM to not respond to our reports. And if you pick up any geo report on an EM cleanup issue, you can flip to the back of the report and find a copy of the agency comment letter from EM. And so in this case, EM essentially said, thanks for your review. We'll get back to you on our plans for implementing your recommendations. So I think a primary question that I'd be asking is, hey, EM, what's your reaction to these recommendations? What plans do you all have to implement the recommendations? What's your timeline look like? Do you want our input on what this forum may look like so that we can make sure that it's an effective forum for all parties involved?
And on the data piece, what do you think? I mean, you asked the questions to find, to find this information. What kind of questions should a local community or state be asking its site to make sure that it's, that it sees, or that the site understands that, like, for example, Los Alamos has been asking for 15 years for this data, and no matter what, they can't get the data. And DOE doesn't want to look at a particular site. And so what are some of the best ways? They've tried everything. What are some of the best ways to ask these questions or to
That
create a policy?
hard to weigh in on that specific case, but I think more generally speaking, questions are like, what assumptions is your site making when generating waste estimates? How does your contractor account for waste potentially generated beyond the terms of their contract? How are you accounting for waste that you haven't yet made a decision about, what to do? What are some scenarios that you're considering, and how are you accounting for this for the long-term disposal? I think I'd be kind of looking at what are those 4 areas that we pointed out as the reasons why they have uncertain estimates, and trying to uncover, how does my site approach this?
And I think I would add to that too, for the forum to be meaningful, I think those questions would need to be answered. And those questions would need to be, the answer to those questions would need to be inputs into both the optimization modeling and the integrated plan.
That's fantastic. I'm going to actually write those out for each one of our communities, because those are all great questions. And I'm sure, like you said, some sites do it, some don't. So it really is a matter of looking at these things and asking for the data consistently from the headquarters, so that headquarters can then be able to analyze what it needs to do. And that's, I think, what you're really saying in this report, which is make sure you have all this data, make sure you know where this waste could potentially go, and then, let's come up with a plan to address all these things for what you can do and recognize what you can't do. And then also, what we always say is treat waste as it actually is, not what, not what you've made up, or not what you've come up with a previous policy to call the waste. Let's look at the actual constituency of the particular waste and treat it the way it should be treated. I know I'm making a lot of statements, so I'll start asking questions. Can't help myself as we go through this. So, one of the things that I wanted to look at also was, or think about was, the model that you outlined, and, to making waste disposal more efficient. And you looked at true waste, and the community aspect of it. How can you use, or how can a state or a community use that model, or look at that model to be able to make decisions about the site?
That's I think a good question, and the credibility of any model, I think, does depend on its transparency. Our model, again, as Amanda explained, was hypothetical. We used the best available data because some data was missing, some data was not available. We created some proxies. But what is also clear about looking at that model is there would be some perceived winners and some perceived losers in that optimization, in that it would restructure or resequence right now what that schedule is for shipping true waste to WIP. The storage costs at some sites are simply significantly greater than the storage cost at other sites for not a difference in the risk profile. That's one waste stream. Who knows what happens if you were to optimize similarly on all the different types of waste streams that are out there, and if the kind of the distribution of winners and losers kind of evens out, so everybody can get something. I don't know. We haven't done that. I'm not sure that the data exists to do that to the same level that we did with true waste. True waste was nice because it was cradle to grave. You could estimate the transportation costs, easily estimated storage costs, et cetera. But as many of us who've spent a lot of time in this area can kind of discern or realize, the agreements that led to the status quo were made in the stovepipe fashion, quite a long time ago. And now we know a lot more. We know a lot more about the risks that some of this waste presents to human health and the environment. Now that we know a lot more, I think common sense would dictate it's okay to revisit some of those agreements and say, okay, were they perfect, or is there an opportunity, to renegotiate on certain areas now that we know more? And by perfect, I don't mean cheapest. That's not what we're trying to argue for here. But costs need to be one of the factors that's considered, and even DOE's own guidance and directives require costs to be considered. Right now, they haven't been to the degree that new data exists on what those true costs are.
As you kind of looked at this program and you looked at the waste, I guess ECA has been calling for a long time on, how do we, look at the waste? Like, the high level waste is now packaged and stored and looked at for Yucca Mountain. And the criteria that were set up for the waste acceptance criteria for that particular site. Obviously, we don't have a site to put high level waste. Did DOE at all get into waste acceptance criteria when it related to high level waste? And are they still looking at, do you know if they're still looking at kind of the Yucca Mountain piece? And then same with the waste acceptance criteria for all the sites. But how did that piece come into this discussion?
Yeah.
Amanda, did you want to take that? I mean, I know that we talked about the Yucca implications of the waste acceptance criteria in our earlier report on Hanford high level waste as well, but go ahead.
Yeah, we didn't do a deep dive into that specific topic, but we do mention it, that this waste, as you just described, Seth, this waste has been treated and packaged as though it would meet the waste acceptance criteria for Yucca Mountain. And because Yucca Mountain has since been terminated, but there's currently, no authority to proceed with an alternate location, it does raise questions. What's going to happen with this waste? There's no reason to believe it's not going to meet future waste acceptance criteria, but there's also no assurance that it will. So I think it's just something for all parties to keep in mind as the cleanup program progresses.
It's interesting. One of the questions came out about, can we use this report to work with the state to look at some of these issues, as we're kind of going forward. And I think, for all of you on the call, that's the reason why I keep saying read this report. And that's why ECA continues to stress it, because you need to look not just at your site. I think what I'm hearing from Amanda and Nathan, but look at all of the sites, because as we ECA have talked about in the past, and we've talked about this with the states, you've got choke points, which is where the waste goes for each of the sites. And I thought you all did a really good job of identifying the waste for each of the sites, and then where the low level waste goes, where the true waste goes, where the high level waste goes. Obviously, we don't have a place for greater than Class C yet either. And then you go in and you also have identified, make sure we treat the waste as it actually is, not just as we currently have it characterized, potentially. when you met with the sites and those types of things, did they talk about those issues at all? How do you actually the waste characterization and the identification of the waste, and then maybe even re-looking at all of the waste and actually characterizing it properly, and then what would that mean for disposal of the waste? You kind of call on that and you suggest that to them, but did anybody kind of think about it in those terms?
You want me to take that, Nathan? Yeah, I'd say this wasn't a direct line of our questioning for this particular review, but in multiple prior GEO reports, we have talked to EM sites about opportunities to manage its waste as other waste types. An example that we, given before, but Hanford low activity waste is one where it's currently being managed as high level waste, but there may be opportunities to reclassify it as low level waste, treat it with grout, and dispose of it offsite at a commercial facility and save potentially tens of billions of dollars. Another example that comes up frequently is that sodium bearing waste out at Idaho, where they're treating it in the integrated waste treatment unit, the IWTU, and they're treating it and packaging it as though it's transuranic waste and that it will be disposed of at WIP. But that waste is tank waste and is currently managed as high level waste, and WIP's permit won't allow tank waste to be disposed of at the site. And so this is kind of an area of conflict in terms of what the law says and what they're actually doing. And at some point, this issue will need to be addressed head on.
And is this something where you've also, characterized the potential cost savings by them undertaking these particular actions?
Yeah, I think in prior work, we've laid out opportunities and potential savings for that. Another report EM put out in 2020 that looked at kind of did an inventory of waste that it's currently being managed as high level waste. And EM looked at, hey, if we were to able to apply the high level waste interpretation and manage this waste as other waste types, I believe EM said it could save up to $220 billion. So there's an enormous potential here to do something different than the status quo.
I'm gonna wrap this up and let you all say any closing remarks that you have. And before you do that, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to answer our questions and to talk to us, because as the Senate has looked at this report and said how important it is, I told you when we read it, we not only said, wow, but we're actually writing a letter to the Department of Energy that follows up on a lot of these action items, because I think that they're critical, especially as we look at budget cuts for the EM program, about how it needs to become more efficient in how we move forward and how it needs to look at these particular waste streams. And I know there's a lot of states on the call right now, and we have a meeting every year, the states, the tribes, and the local governments around the sites. And as you said, everyone needs to come together and talk about these issues and look at how we can kind of work together to make this more efficient with DOE. And so that's something that I'm going to look forward to doing in November. And I think this report's going to give everybody a lot to think about and talk about. So I just want to thank you, and then I'll let you all each close out.
Amanda, do you
All
want to
right, I'll go first.
close out first?
No, I just want to thank you, Seth, for giving us the opportunity to share more about this report. We're fully aware it's a long and dense report, but has a lot of really good information. And so I'm glad that we have the chance to share a little bit more and walk everyone through the findings of our report. And I do think that the recommendations that we've laid out in the report have great opportunity to help EM move forward on this disposal challenge. And I'll let Nathan close out.
Yeah, first, I very much want to say thank you. we appreciate the opportunity to not only talk about this, but Seth, to continue to engage with you and your folks about sustaining and increasing the momentum of the implications of this report, the findings, the recommendations, et cetera. We do this work because, like many of you, we're all interested in good government and improving government where possible. We're sometimes in the unique position to be able to find and recommend things that ultimately result in changing the framework. Sometimes DOE can't do certain things, right? I don't think DOE can unilaterally say, you know what, let's create a forum and renegotiate these agreements that we've already agreed to with the states. But I think we've demonstrated there could be some substantial benefits from doing so, and putting that information and those findings before Congress and having Congress compel the department to do it, ends up breaking through, perhaps and creating some inertia where it needs to exist. I'd like to put a plug in for a report that we issued several years ago too on leadership capacity. I think that some of the stagnation that can exist in this space can occur because leadership changes a lot at EM. And as a practical matter, what that results in is sites making agreements and plans with the site officials that might not change quite as frequently. But if there is more leadership stability, maybe less leadership turnover at the EM1 level and EM2 level in Washington, D.C., or maybe even a longer term appointment, then you can start having those negotiations and those agreements that last longer, because then you don't think, okay, well, this agreement is just going to be thrown out when the new EM1 comes into town. And so I think that there is benefit too in looking at the fact that this has to be something that leadership commits to. And then when you have that commitment, it has to be sustained. Because if this is pursued for a year or two and then discarded in pursuit of another initiative, you've increased the trust deficit rather than actually increasing momentum on something that could improve government. So we issued that report, EM leadership capacity, in the 2022 timeframe, and I think it still has legs and relevance today. But at the end, again, thank you. I know that there's a number of questions that were asked that we probably didn't get to. I'd ask maybe AJ or others at ECA if you could find a way to get those questions to me and Amanda. We'll happy to respond in person because those are good questions, and I don't want you to think that we missed them.
Great, and I think the good news is I think we answered some of them, and we will make sure that everybody gets an answer on all these, and we'll work with you to do that. And we just want to remind everybody that this information will be available on our webpage, and we'll make sure that we highlight the other reports as well on our webpage in this presentation. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which is going to be on financing new nuclear reactors and advanced reactors. And that's going to be in early September. And then we look forward to seeing you at the cleanup workshop later in September. And please, if you have any issues, especially for the ECA members, that you want us to cover on these webinars, we look forward to doing that. And once again, Amanda and Nathan, thank you very much. And we'll say goodbye to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Appreciate it.